Kaden Lee is going to be a Missouri Tiger. This, according to my source close to the team. What adding the former Ole Miss receiver means to the Tigers, let's talk about it on Locked On Mizzou.
You are Locked On Mizzou, your daily podcast on the Missouri Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, all you true sons and daughters, I'm John Miller, your Mizzou mafioso and the central scrutinizer of Missouri Tigers football and basketball. And believe it or not, Charles Bediako, a former Alabama Crimson Tide basketball player from a couple years ago, there's a chance he could be playing against Missouri here in the next week or so. Could there be a more 2026 situation than this? But speaking of 26, I got to recap Mizzou football's portal situation here, the additions, the subtractions. Was it a net gain, a net loss? What are we thinking here? But you know what? Before I start the program, I do want to remind you, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. FanDuel is officially in playoff mode. Every game day during the NFL playoffs, FanDuel is giving customers even more ways to get in on the action. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. And you know what? There's been a lot of interesting Kaden Lee rumors being bandied about and social media sleuthing happening, including by myself. But as of last night, Cayden Lee finally officially in the transfer portal, which is interesting timing because speaking of sources, well, I have another source who is telling me that Trinidad Chambliss, the, current Ole Miss quarterback, I suppose you could say, certainly the most recent starting quarterback for Ole Miss, well, he's looking for a waiver for his 6th year. My information is saying that at least the Chambliss camp is feeling pretty confident about said waiver, and yet with Lee entering the portal, with Eli Drinkwitz putting out his bat signal, his patented bat signal on social media this morning when breaking news is about to happen on the recruiting front, well, it seems like all of the signs were pointing toward Cayden Lee being a Missouri Tiger. Well, now I have a source close to Mizzou that is telling me that Lee is literally on his way to Columbia. So at this point, we're just waiting for official confirmation, but it sure seems like a strong indication here that Austin Simmons, the new Missouri quarterback and another former Ole Miss Rebel, is going to be having one of his best buddies from that team join him in Columbia. By the way, what does this mean for the Tigers? Well, this means another really good option at receiver after, I'm going to recap this here in a little bit, but obviously the Tigers lost a couple of important receivers with Josh Manning and Marquise Johnson to the portal, and of course Kevin Coleman Jr. running out of eligibility as well. So adding Cayden Lee here, I feel like I want to say Cayden Green constantly, which I accidentally spelled out on my short here. No, not Cayden Green, the Missouri offensive lineman, but Cayden Lee, the new Missouri wide receiver, had 44 catches for 635 yards this past season with the Rebels. In 2024, he was even more productive than that with 57 catches for 874 yards. So what Missouri is getting here is something it needed. It's getting proven SEC production at the wide receiver position, plus a guy who has obvious chemistry with Austin Simmons as well. So this is a absolutely huge win here late in the process for Missouri, getting Cayden Lee, the new Missouri receiver. By the way, just as I pointed out yesterday, I think Missouri has finished incredibly strong here in the portal. So if indeed Missouri was being patient, trying to save its money, I think they've budgeted pretty well if indeed that was the goal here, because by getting Lee, by getting another Ole Miss guy, Chris Graves Jr. in the secondary yesterday, Zach Owens as well, the big offensive lineman from Mississippi State, Tigers just adding a lot of interesting guys here right at the finish. Some of the strongest additions they've had here right in, the 72nd hour, figuratively speaking. So speaking of the portal, I feel like it's probably a decent idea to actually recap the portal a little bit. I know not everyone follows this stuff or listens to the podcast every single day and just dives into it as deeply as I do. So you know what? I'm going to do this on occasion, and let's just start on the offensive side of the ball and what Missouri lost. And I'm not going to include absolutely every single person here, just what I think are the most significant names. Starting, of course, with Bo Pribula, the Missouri quarterback, and Marquise Johnson, Joshua Manning, the two receivers I mentioned. Also Daniel Blood, another veteran receiver who didn't get as much time really as I thought he would going on in his Missouri career. Marquise Davis, a promising young running back, and also Javen Richardson, a guy I would say a swing backup tackle who filled in for Cayden Lee in the South Carolina game at tackle very admirably, I thought. So some of those guys are losses. Some of them, though, like Bo Pribula, I would say, while Bo is a loss on paper, I think it's really a net gain. If you assume that Austin Simmons is going to be more productive than Bo this past season, well, then that's not really a loss then, is it? And on those gains, by the way, well, of course, there is Austin Simmons. And at the wide receiver position, not only has Missouri added Cayden Lee from Ole Miss, but had previously added other SEC quality players. For example, Horatio Fields from Auburn. Also Caleb Goody as well from Cincinnati. Now you're talking about a pretty interesting wide receiver room, along with Donovan Olubade and other players that Missouri has been able to retain here. I actually like our wide receiver room now quite a bit. I think Missouri has a lot of good, interesting talent there, along with, again, with Lee, with Fields, with Caleb Goody, all guys who have proven that they can play at this level. And, of course, Donovan Olubade proved he could play at this level as just a true freshman, as being one of the more impressive contested catch guys in the league, certainly as a young player. So I'm starting to really like what Missouri did at the wide receiver position, giving themselves a bunch of options, again, especially with Lee in the fold. And by the way, I'm just realizing I failed to mention another Missouri addition at receiver, Nashawn Montgomery from Florida as well, another talented player that my colleague Brandon Olson over at Locked On Gators is a fan of. And when it comes to the Missouri offense, of course, quarterback was the first need. Missouri filled it very early in the process. Now, when it comes to running backs and tight ends, Missouri was pretty much set there and acted accordingly. Obviously, offensive line is the other spot that Missouri needed to hit, and I think it pretty much hit it out of the ballpark as much as you could have realistically expected. Again, especially with the late addition here of Zach Owens from Mississippi State. You've also got former Arizona State lineman Josh Atkins. To me, those are two guys who could probably start at tackle for you right now, potentially. And with Luke Work, another Mississippi State Bulldog, a guy who's played multiple positions, I really like what Missouri's done on the offensive line at the end of the day here as well. And by the way, it's not literally the end of the day, as there is still opportunity for Missouri to add players here. I'm just saying, as we're getting to sunset here at dusk time, I'm starting to like what Missouri has done, especially at positions of need. And again, recapping those linemen and those options a little bit, I think Missouri has a lot more options at tackle than maybe it did last season, to the point where I could see Cayden Lee, by the way, swinging back to left guard once again, where he was a preseason All-American before kicking out to left tackle with a few weeks to go in fall camp. That seems like a real possibility to me, and one that might truly strengthen Missouri's offensive line. The point here is that I think Missouri has added enough talent and enough flexibility that they have a lot of different options on who they can play as their best five up front. And you know what? I do have to talk about the defensive side of the ball as well, where Missouri has even more to replace than it did on the offensive side of the ball. So the Tigers were definitely going to have to make some choices. What choices did they make? Let's recap the defensive side of the ball coming up here in just a second as well. But of course, it is tax season, but that doesn't mean that tax season has to take over your entire life. You see, this year, TurboTax is making it easier than ever just to hand things off and move on with your life. Because with TurboTax full service, you can have your taxes done for you by a trusted local expert, start to finish, without the stress or the guesswork. And I mean, they truly handle everything from W-2s to self-employed forms, and they work to get you every single deduction. So yes, you're going to be paying for TurboTax service, but I got news for you. Saving money on the other end, it's going to pay for itself. So for a limited time, you can have your taxes done by a local TurboTax expert for just $150 all in if a TurboTax expert did not file for you last year. Just file by February 28th. Take taxes off your plate and get back to your life. Visit TurboTax.com/local to book your appointment today. So just to recap my thoughts on the Mizzou offense in the portal this offseason, clearly Missouri got a quarterback that it wanted. It attacked wide receiver and added several options from the high major Power 4 conferences, by the way, including the SEC. They added a lot of offensive line depth, especially at tackle. You got to love that if you're Austin Simmons. And while defensively, though, well, I think Missouri had a lot more difficult choices to make because, well, Missouri knew what it had coming back once again, especially at running back and tight end, for example. But on the defensive side of the ball, with Zion Wilson exhausting his eligibility, with Damon Wilson evidently leaving Missouri. He's still in the transfer portal without a new home as of yet. Also, Nate Johnson, another backup edge, going to Auburn. Javion Hilson, a much ballyhooed edge coming out of high school, certainly, and then a couple of safeties, Marvin Burks and Mose Phillips, were the most notable departures in the portal. But of course, most notably of all was all of the players like Zion Young who had exhausted their eligibility. And of course, guys like Dre Norwood and Toriano Pride in the secondary, and Stephen Hall as well. And Josiah Trotter going off to the NFL. His 1 year at Missouri, as productive as it was, ended up being just that 1 year. So Missouri had just a ton to replace. In fact, basically all of their regular starters had to be replaced. Well, Robert Woodyard Jr. joining along now, the former Auburn linebacker, and really as good of a one-for-one as you were going to find. Not a perfect one-for-one, of course. No one is. But Robert Woodyard Jr. was really good in the Missouri-Auburn game last season. Believe he had 14 tackles. Clearly caught the eye of one Eli Drinkwitz, among others. And he's going to be, along with Nick Rodriguez, who had, speaking of a big game, well, he had a huge Gator Bowl as well. Those are looking like Missouri's top two linebackers there. And Missouri didn't have to do a whole lot of a heck else at the linebacker position. That was one thing I suggested early in the process. Hey, now that you've got Robert Woodyard Jr., just be done at linebacker. And for all intents and purposes, that's what Missouri did here. Certainly, he's the only major money name that you're going to find at that position in the portal this offseason. But Chris Graves Jr., I thought, speaking of places that Missouri really needed to attack, well, I talked about receiver and O-line on the offensive side. Obviously, with the three guys graduating from the cornerback position, adding Chris Graves Jr. from Ole Miss, adding Jaleel Florence from Oregon, Sione Laulule from Oregon as well, and also Elijah Dotson from Michigan. I mean, again, four major programs there. We'll see if these guys collectively, three of those guys I think are young players that still need some development, need some some measure. Well, let's say two of them, Dotson and Laulule, I think in particular, are still two young guys with high upside, whereas Chris Graves is almost your surefire starter, and Jaleel Florence, I think, is Missouri's hoping he's that, coming off of maybe an injury-plagued season or two. I think that's the hope there, is that now with enough injury recovery time that Jaleel Florence will be back to his previous high level of play that he showed for Oregon, especially in 2023. And then at the safety position as well, again, a lot of big names as far as names, names from big name programs, guys that haven't necessarily reached their peaks either. Guys like Jadon Blair, a guy who's played 1 year at Notre Dame, Kinsley Faustin from Auburn. And then up front, well, fewer additions and fewer sure thing starters, I would say. I'm not sure Missouri really did add a sure thing starter on the edge or even up front. Probably the most notable names, Jaden Jones from Florida State on the edge, Dante Simpson on the inside from Miami, CJ May from Louisville on the outside. What I think that speaks to is I think Missouri, again, this is just me guessing here, kind of putting two and two together, but it seems like Missouri likes not only the guys they currently have from last year's roster, Langdon Kitchen and Darius Smith, who played quite a bit as the backups to Damon Wilson and Zion Young, but two guys that I think they really like for this upcoming season. And Kitchen, with his second year of FBS football, his second year of SEC football, was already a pretty productive player in limited action last season. And Darius Smith, to me, the former Georgia Bulldog who tore his ACL in the offseason of 2024, I believe August of 2024. Well, he's now had an entire season of playing, an entire season of recovery. I think 2026 could be a big-time Darius Smith season. So for Missouri to go with a little bit more higher upside, for them to go with a little bit more potential over production at the edge position, I think makes a lot of sense in terms of, hey, where do I need to use my resources the most? Well, I think it had to be the secondary, really. I think Missouri clearly wants experience on the back end in that position to avoid the types of big explosive plays and coverage busts that you saw at times from the Tigers last season, even with quite a bit of veterans in that secondary. So I think one thing Missouri values, one thing Eli Drinkwitz certainly values, is a lot of experience. And I think with where they decided to put most of their money and try to get some experience, at least defensively, hey, that one linebacker position and then the back end. Let's make sure we protect ourselves on the back end, because I think Missouri's shown a pretty good ability to rotate and develop defensive linemen. So all of this, I think this just tells me once again that Missouri likes its edge starters at the very least. And, you know, some of these guys that they've attacked here with the secondary very, very hard, some of them are going to pan out, that's for sure. And coming up on the program, I do want to talk about Mizzou basketball, specifically Anthony Robinson, and what I believe he can do to turn his season around for the Tigers. Plus, you may have heard about Charles Bediako, the former Alabama center, who is evidently going to be playing basketball for the Crimson Tide on Saturday once again, and could even be suiting up against the Tigers next Tuesday, despite playing in the G League and also being in the NBA's G League, by the way, and despite last playing for the Crimson Tide in the 22-23 season, yes, anything is possible, evidently, in 2026. So let's talk about this bizarre situation and Ant Robinson coming up right after these quick words. Now, Dennis Gates is certainly a new school type of guy when it comes to basketball. And, well, like most SEC and college basketball coaches in general these days, they've pretty much abandoned the mid-range offensively and defensively. Well, if as much as they can, they like to funnel opposing offenses into the mid-range, force them to take what are typically lower efficiency mid-range shots. And I say typically because, well, not every mid-range shot, every mid-range shooter in particular is created equally because, well, your typical player is going to maybe make 40% of his mid-range shots. But some of the greats, of course, Kevin Durant, Michael Jordan, guys like that, Chris Paul, for example, have feasted in the mid-range, shooting 50, 55 type percent, even higher in like Kevin Durant, MJ's cases in some spots on the floor. Well, to me, Anthony Robinson has abandoned his mid-range shot a little bit. And you saw in the previous basketball game, by the way, I believe Anthony hit a shot from mid-range. He hit a shot from the elbow, which to me was kind of his bread and butter last season, and it ended up being the only field goal he made on the game. Robinson goes 1 of 7 from the floor, including 0 of 4 from the three-point line. And it's getting to the point now where you almost want to dare him to shoot the basketball because it seems like he's just in a slump at this point. And to me, if everything is you either have to get all the way to the rim, which for Robinson at his size is not always going to be very easy in the SEC. If everything is either at the rim or a three-pointer, I'm not really sure how you get out of your slump. Because it seems like Robinson, a lot of what he's trying to do is draw fouls and get to the free throw line. Well, unfortunately, the free throw shot has abandoned him a little bit as well. And to me, I think he's got to get back to that mid-range shot. And as much as on paper that might not be the most efficient thing in the world, well, going 1 of 7 from the floor, that in itself is inefficient. Going 0 of 4 from the three-point line is obviously inefficient. And I thought John Sunvold, by the way, a couple games ago against LSU, had an interesting comment. This wasn't about Robinson. This was just about in general, about playing at this level of basketball, which is that when you drive as a guard, your decision making comes at the mid-range level. Basically what he was saying is you have to make your decision then when you're 15 feet away or so, basically the foul line. When you're at that moment, that's when you have to decide if you're going to pass, pull up, or take it all the way to the basket. And for Robinson, to me, abandoning that shot, as he mostly has in the last few games and for most of this season, to me it opens up everything else. Because if you don't have to worry about him in the paint so much, if you don't have to worry about him on the three-point line, now he's just trying to play the James Harden game and draw fouls. And that's just, not only is that ugly basketball, just if you're having to rely on the officials to call the game how you want it, that's just not going to be a consistent way to play basketball. And that's something that hasn't been just an Anthony Robinson thing, by the way. It's been a bit of a Missouri thing as well. But speaking of Missouri things, believe it or not, this Charles Bediako thing could potentially affect Missouri. Just to recap, for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, this was first reported on very well by Nick Kelly, by the way, over at AL.com. And according to him, and this has been confirmed by others, Charles Bediako, who again last played for the Tide in 2023, in March of 2023, has been granted a temporary restraining order after suing the NCAA, which means he's immediately eligible to participate in basketball activities for the Tide, including games, by the way. So this basically means it's going to remain in effect for 10 days. So at least that long. There is just one game in that period. On the 27th, the day of that hearing, that is when Missouri is scheduled to face Bediako and the Crimson Tide. So it appears right now that this game on, the 27th here? Whenever Alabama's next game here is against Tennessee here, according to Nick Kelly once again, well, seems like he's going to be able to play for the Volunteers. How much he actually plays, I'm not sure. But this is a really bizarre situation because, let's be clear here, the NCAA is not allowing this. In fact, they're fighting it. They're saying he shouldn't be allowed to play for the simple reason that he declared himself eligible for the NBA draft and signed a two-way contract, by the way, meaning that his the team that owns his rights can call him up to the NBA at any time. But Bediako, again, to be clear here, has never played in the NBA, but he has played in the NBA's G League. So if signing a two-way NBA contract doesn't make you a professional basketball player, well, I'm not really sure what does. I guess if the standard is, hey, if you played a second in the NBA, if you've ever put on an NBA uniform, that means you're a professional basketball player. Well, that's a different definition, because there's a lot of different places you can make money playing basketball. Hey, if this is just a free-for-all, then I guess anybody who, like Bediako, played 2 years of college basketball, I guess there are guys like, I guess Kareem Rush still has a year left. I was going to say Kobe Brown or Drew Smith, but I think they're out of eligibility at least. But again, if Trinidad Chambliss thinks he can get another year, if Carson Beck gets another year, I don't know what to make of all of this stuff. But we've definitely hit the height of absurdity here. And I'd really like to know what exactly the case here is for Bediako. He certainly could have chosen to come back to basketball, college basketball, and make more money a couple years ago. And in retrospect, that probably is what he should have done, considering he has not set foot on an NBA court yet. But you know what? Choices have consequences, and I don't know why. I really can't understand the argument here whatsoever from Bediako's perspective. But sounds like there's at least an outside chance he might play against Missouri in their next game. If that happens, would be pretty bizarre. And by the way, are we not, from the NCAA's perspective, could they not take that victory away in the future? Who cares, right? I just find this thing utterly bizarre. But regardless, hopefully you've found my opinions at least slightly less than bizarre on this program today. And by the way, if you'd like an ad-free version of this show, or you'd like to, well, chat myself up and my fellow Locked On hosts directly, well, you got to check out the Everydayer Club, lockedonpodcast.com/everydayer. $5 a month, $50 a year, again, for ad-free shows, for access to our Discord server where you can chat up myself and all of the Locked On hosts, talk some hoops and football and everything in between. Again, Everydayer Club, check it out. The link is in the description of this podcast. So you know what? Until next time, I'm John Miller. Thanks, as always, for listening to Locked On Mizzou.